Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited for today's conversation. Today, I'm joined by John Ziegler, founder of Healthcare Due Diligence Group, or HDIG. What stood out to me in reviewing your background, John, is how consistently your work sits at the intersection of healthcare operations, investment risks, decision making under uncertainty. You're not just advising on deals, you've built a firm that treats diligence as a strategic lever and not just a checkbox. So, your natural career path is spanned many different areas, include healthcare services, M&A advisory, operating strategy. Feels like a natural build-up to what HDIG is doing today. And I'm really excited to unpack how that perspective is changing how investors think about diligence. So why don't we just jump into the questions here, John? Is that all right with you?
Sounds great.
Okay, so today's theme is the hidden costs of inefficient due diligence in venture capital and private equity. So, John, here's one of my first opening questions. You've transitioned from printing industry where you focus on messaging effectiveness to healthcare innovation and now HDIG, which provides deep data insights for investors. How has this journey informed your perspective on the critical role of thorough due diligence in VC and PE, and what initially drew you to address this specific pain point?
That's a fun, good question. I will back up just for a second and say that it's Healthcare Development and Innovation Group.
My
That's how it
apologies.
breaks down to HDIG. But the interesting thing about the printing industry and what I was doing, was producing things that went into the mail stream. And what I found in that particular space was a misalignment of motivations from my clients. For example, when I'm producing something for the mail stream, the question was always, can you reduce the cost per thousand of the number of pieces going out the door? However, the real issue for the client of the person that was actually asking us to do the production was, how can I improve my response rates? So there was two different motivations, but two different things that you could do due diligence around. One wants to lower your cost. The other says, I don't care what the cost is, just get me more people to buy my goods and services. So it also led me to understand another part of the printing industry, and that was at that time in the early aughts was the problem with generalizations. The perception was that the printing industry was dying, and therefore the valuations for selling a printing industry were going to be much less than maybe they were 15 years prior, 10 years prior. So your multiple on your EBITDA was going to be less. But that wasn't the whole story. There were some printing companies that were doing very well because they segmented. They focused on things like large format, display printing. There were some really cool tools that were coming out to allow you to utilize large format as a way in which you could actually redecorate or redesign your entire retail space. So those two things, misaligned motivations and generalization, led me to think that, okay, I've got to be careful in one, at that time, selling my company. And then two, if anybody else was valuing something, they have to be careful of those two particular things. So what were the motivations of your audience members that are looking at your asset? And are you listening to them carefully to understand, or you as an evaluator, understanding you may be generalizing and not finding those diamonds in the rough?
Well, that's great. And your work with HDIG involves leveraging historic data, purchasing contract, geospatial databases, commercial databases to understand the origin story, if you will, and trajectory of the IP.
Yeah.
Can you explain how this comprehensive data-driven approach directly combats the hidden costs that often arise from traditional, less efficient due diligence processes?
Yeah, I'll talk about first what some of those inefficiencies are, and then relate then what we're doing to combat those. For example, we see an over-reliance on personal experience. What that means, perhaps in practice, is that because this happens a lot with the venture people, they've found success in the buying and selling a particular company or asset, and therefore it they suspect that I should always look for those exact same things, or I am relying on what I am familiar with. Another The other problem is when you don't have a lot of data to draw on, you're also going to rely on nuances. And that is that your craftsmanship will take on more importance than the actual technical details around the thing that you're evaluating. Um, Also, I go back to generalization. There's a reliance on big themes like TAM, total addressable market. I mean, you'll see a pitch on something that's very minute, like maybe it's a new catheter, but they'll give you something that says, well, the total addressable market and cardiothoracic surgery is somewhere around $20 billion. Well, you're not going to come up with something that's you found a specific niche for, and therefore you will have an opportunity to participate in a very large percentage of a $220 billion addressable market. So those are some of the things that we try to combat. And how do we do that? What we're going to be doing is looking at something that you hoped would occur when you're evaluating a particular company that has had an ARR of $5 million, been around for multiple years. And that is, you've got some historical data that you can draw on to say, this is why it's valued at this number. In our particular case, that makes sense. Let's find ways in which we can do the exact same thing with something that's novel. And what novelty means in our sense is something that's not really that novel. I like to say that the wheel was invented once and everything else is an improvement, and that's extremely valuable. But what it also lends itself to is the idea that if you can do the search on something that was created to do something similar to what your solution is trying to do, and find its trajectory. Where did it begin? Who were the people involved? If they took on additional capital, what was the value at that point? Those are the things that will give you better insights and instruction on how to value something. And what we try to do is allow you to get to those answers much more quickly.
Well, that's got to be extremely valuable for your clients. And I'm a big believer in data, right? Data speaks volumes, and you can find trends and much more insights into that. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that then. When we met prior, you mentioned John Wanamaker's famous quote about wasted advertising dollars. In the context of VC and PE, what are some of the 50% unknown hidden costs that arise when due diligence is inefficient or incomplete, particularly when evaluating new technologies or IP?
Yeah, so the quote that you're referencing, as you said, was John Wanamaker, where he said that he loses 50% of his advertising dollar. He just doesn't know which 50%. So I thought that was funny. So what that looks like is like if you don't have the detail, you come up with a very difficult way of defending the valuations, which lead to more research time, kind of that lack of trust. How do I say that? Why do I believe that number that you have? Well, I'm going to do my own work because you just haven't presented enough of information to know which side of that 50% you're on. There's a lot of guessing that is too often is reliant upon to come up with personal experiences. I've seen something like this, so I think this is what the value should be. We think what's really important here is to lean into an understanding of your freedom to operate. Make sure that that's part of your whole evaluation. Again, going back to that example of cardiovascular surgery at $20 billion. How many entrants are there? So you slice that number, a million times, and there's only $20, worth of value for you. So what is that freedom to operate? How many people are in there? That's one of those things that sits on the side of you better know, because if you don't know, you're going to be researching again. So that's kind of where some of the examples of inefficiency can occur when you're not really understanding what you're missing.
That's great. So earlier you just mentioned, a lot of the due diligence relies on, personal experiences, maybe a club-like mentality in venture capital. How does your data-driven approach and methodology with due diligence, like the one you employ, help democratize access to quality deals, potentially expose opportunities or risks that might have otherwise been missed by traditional networks. Maybe some examples here, John, would be great for the audience.
So, yeah, one of the things that I use the club mentality kind of pejoratively, but it's really an easy way of thinking about um, relying on past successes as the predictor for future successes. So, um, you know, there's trust. Yes, you need trust. You need trust in the people that you're working with and the evaluations. Um, but even the largest and most, arguably most successful venture firms have hit rates like on the West and the East Coast could be, 5%, but they'll get some unicorns. So you still want to be involved with them. So that's your idea of being in this club. Like I got to be related to them. Um, an example of where that can become a problem is if you are, for example, a hospital that has an innovation center. This is a real life example that they gave me. They have one of those well-renowned venture firms come to them on a monthly basis with opportunities because they trust this company because it had many successes in the past. By the end of the year, they are pitched over 400 companies from their portfolio. Now, again, if we go back to 95% of those not being successful, even if they've been vetted by these large companies, the issue becomes how am I assured that that my selection is the right selection? I think it's a wonderful place to start with somebody brings you some great ideas. But the problem is that you will have a company that maybe is not right for your ecosystem as you experience it. It's really important to understand, as in this particular case, it's a hospital has an innovation center. They know not only their patients, but their operations at the hospital. They know whether or not something like what is being provided to them will work. So now that they know it will work, that's really important. They can rely on us then to say, okay, of those things that will work, are there any others that are in that space? And that's where we can come in and really help them recognize it's okay to have a lot of opportunity to look at, but you better know which of those opportunities are going to be the most valuable for you because you probably aren't going to hit the same rate. You're not going to get a unicorn
Right.
yourself if you're one of many that's also putting money into one of those 400 opportunities.
Absolutely. It goes to a tenet I always strive to use myself as voice of the customer. What does the customer need? And there's no better opportunity to have an innovation center in the customer setting, right? In the hospital. So you get real life feedback on will this work or won't it? Thank you. Very good insight. And good to see hospitals are doing this as well. When we talk about the due diligence and future trends, your ability to track all this information, the market trajectory, I mean, your data set goes back decades upon decades. It's extremely powerful. Can you share some specific examples or case studies where this comprehensive data insight uncovered some critical risks or opportunities that the traditional due diligence process probably would have missed? I'm assuming saving a client, significant hidden costs.
Sure. One particularly interesting example was, again, a device manufacturer. They had a wonderful idea around a device. But what we were able to uncover were two particular things. One, since this database goes back so far, and we're looking at IP similarities, what we were able to see were the researcher's roles and the stability of that researcher that was involved. And what we found in that particular case was that the researcher twice previously had tried to be injected in the role as CEO as well. Mm. Up to the point of post-seed investment, getting ready for the A round, they shifted back to academia. Mm. Here they are again, in this particular case, showing up as an individual that is in the leadership role of this company. But by looking back on historical data, we brought the insight that there's some red flags here. You should be very careful because it has been systematically proven that this individual has a tendency to bail when the going gets tough. So that was one example. Another one was recognizing in device manufacturing, the inclusion of AI is omnipresent. Now you need to interact with your EHR, your electronic health record. It's very important to see who some of the developers were that were involved there. What are the components that were in there? Were there any standardized parts? One, standardized parts allow you to get through the FDA more quickly, but it also lowers your barrier to the threats. Your moat is shallower. So recognizing that has an impact on your valuation as well. And as I was alluding to before, there are some things that happen in the AI build or the coding that if you had borrowed from something else, there's some security risks that are created there. So those are a couple of things that just by doing a prompt is not going to reveal to you.
Right. So in our prior conversation, in my prior world, right, monitoring, policy is critically important as well. And the shifts that you're seeing, what you highlighted to me is the current headwinds are, the government's looking for private industry to shoulder more of that risk. How do these policy trends impact the landscape of due diligence and healthcare innovation, and what hidden costs, if you will, might arise from firms that fail to look at those policy changes or even draft legislation?
Yeah, you say it well for recognizing that those can be potential important variables to the longevity that's absolutely necessary to that longevity, meaning capital longevity in this particular case. So some of those headwinds and tailwinds in policy that can occur. Let's take what is really important right now as we see it is a growth in personal responsibility, as well as you were mentioning, private responsibility for taking on more of the burden of investment into early stage companies. But from the personal responsibility standpoint, the present administration, this is just an example of today, the present administration feels very strongly about personal responsibility. And the way that's being translated is through CMS and their CMS Access program, which is really putting more weight behind value-based care, which means, not fee for service, but rather you are getting rewarded for improved outcomes. It's your outcomes you're getting paid for. What that means is that there's a greater reliance on remote patient monitoring. So if you're somebody that has a tool that improves remote patient monitoring and access to client information, you will probably have a greater value for the next foreseeable tenure term or whatever. Because through something like CMS Access, we know that included in some of this legislation is an increase in dollar amount for each CTP code that is associated with remote patient monitoring, and a greater number of codes being generated for reimbursement. So that really tells you a lot about the likelihood of a company's opportunity to have find quick revenue streams. Conversely, if you are, let's say, an institution that has been very successful in the past in receiving grant funding because you live just outside of some of these elite locations, there is a right now going through Congress the Innovate Act, which is going to refund the SBIR and STTR grants, but it's following some of the administration's mandates, and that is to move money away from elite institutions and into what they're calling emerging states. So what that means is if you are, and let's say you are a lot of labs have been formed. There are maybe labs that are enabling you to, you can lease space there, but you've been, you got to buy all this equipment, you're having it there, so you'll have raised capital to offset your expenditures. But if fewer and fewer opportunities are presenting themselves there because the policy as ship is saying, I don't want things being purchased there or invested in there. I want them to go other places. Well, that should tell you something about the value of what you've created in that location.
Oh, that's great. Well, I've got one last question for you, John. Some of our pre questions that kind of rolled together, so I've blended them together because you've already answered them. So thank you for two birds with
I
one
hope I
stone
will.
type of analogy. So for closing thoughts, can you leave the audience, for a VC or PE firm looking to significantly reduce that hidden cost of efficient due diligence? What is the single most important change they should implement in their process, and how can HDIG, your company, support that change?
Well, I'm going to lean into something which has the lowest margin for us, but I think it has the most value for our clients. And that is going back to something we talked about in the very beginning. It's kind of the ability to separate the wheat from the chaff. I would say the most important thing is to investigate the best mechanisms available to you to enable you to decide whether or not this particular piece of IP that you're looking at is worthy of future time and effort or not. So that's something that we do, one, really quickly and really, really inexpensively. For example, you can upload a pitch deck in about 15 minutes. We can deliver to you your commercializability score, your scientific value score, a tech readiness level score, and an executive summary about the value of that asset and where it needs to get a little bit more emphasis on your point. And because there's a score associated with that, we'll give you a little hint here, and that is if you have a 70 as your commercializability score, you sit on the precipice of probable success versus possible success. So you want to be able to find those things that will enable you to quickly do the due diligence that is of least value, so that you can take your really intelligent people and focus in on the nuances that enable you to then say, this is how this particular piece of IP will succeed.
Yeah, what a great offering. I'm a firm believer in gate reviews, periodic checks, and quantitative analysis with, it sounds like, a scoring system that your company has to say, this idea is going to be favorable or maybe not unfavorable. And certainly appreciate that perspective. I hope other people who listen to this can reach out to you and the team to help them with that initial sanity check at the onset. So,
Sanity
John,
check.
thank you so much for sharing your insights. This has been incredibly valuable. I really appreciate your time and openness, your perspective. It makes it really clear that diligence just isn't about reducing downside risk. It's about creating a better outcome across the entire investment lifecycle, and maybe earlier on, and save some time and effort right at the onset. So thank you, John. Really
Well,
appreciate your
thank
time.
you, Blaine, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness of all of your questions. Really took a lot of energy to get there, and they were great questions.
Thank you. More to come.